Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the misty canals of Venice where the walls of centuries-old palaces sigh with stories, and the flicker of lanterns casts trembling shadows on worn stone. You float past weathered wooden posts jutting from green water, the faint scent of salt and moss curling around your nose like a whisper, and above you, shuttered windows stare down like tired eyes while somewhere beneath the hush of midnight something breathes that isn't wind. You won't see it. You might not even hear it. But if you stay too long in one of those dark palazzos, well, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments, because I want to know who's listening, and from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together as you trudge along the narrow streets that feel like they're closing in with layers of stone, draped ivy, and brick passageways too tight for cars but perfect for echoing footsteps that don't belong to you. Venice has always been a city of masks and mirrors, where truth winks at you before ducking into the fog, and long ago its palaces rose like marble fortresses on soft mud. Their foundations nothing more than ancient logs driven into the lagoon and locked together by pure stubbornness, yet somehow they've lasted centuries, and with that kind of architectural defiance came whispers not just of ghosts, but of voices no one could explain. You're standing now beside one of those palaces, its massive wooden door split and buckled like a spine, a metal lion's head staring back at you from the knocker, open-mouthed in a silent roar. And inside there's nothing but stillness, the kind that presses against your chest while candles burn in their sconces with a lazy drip of wax. You swear you hear something, a soft murmur, almost a breath, but when you turn, there's no one, and the fresco above you depicts angels and warriors in gold robes, but in the dim light one of them seems to be crying. That's the thing about these palaces, they were built to dazzle, to intimidate. To make you forget how close you were to drowning in the politics below, and behind every painted ceiling is a power struggle, an affair, or a betrayal so sharp you could use it to shave your conscience. Mainstream historians agree that Venice in its heyday, think 13th to 17th century, was an economic and cultural powerhouse. But there's also the fringe idea that its rise was fueled by secret societies and maritime deals struck under moonlight, whispered into the water itself. You feel it now. A current beneath your feet, like the floor's not as stable as you thought, and you pass a mirror, those gilded Venetian ones, rimmed with black glass and delicate silver filigree, and for half a second your reflection tilts its head before you do. Maybe it's the trick of candlelight, maybe. You step into the ballroom, which yawns wide with echoes, its marble floor veined like bone and chandeliers above swaying ever so slightly. Though the air is dead, some say this room once held hundreds dancing, laughing, plotting, but those same people will swear they saw guests frozen in place mid-step, their faces slack and silent only to vanish when the lights flickered, and you run a finger over a velvet drape that smells of time and dust, curling under your touch like a sleeping cat. Historians still argue whether these ghost stories grew from real incidents, fires, drownings, tragic love, or whether they were spun by bored aristocrats sipping fortified wine and hoping for drama. But as you stand here listening to the silence, there's a faint rustle of fabric behind you, and you turn. Nothing, except the painting has changed, or maybe you're imagining that, but the woman in it smiles now, faintly, like she knows something you don't. Outside, the canals pulse with quiet, somewhere a gondola creaks though no oars touch the water, and you remember tales of boats that drifted unsteered, guided only by the sighs of those who never quite left you. Lean on the railing, and for just a moment the stone feels warm, like someone rested their hand there before you. Word count 1073. You take a step deeper into the belly of the palace, past gold leaf curling off the frame of a forgotten portrait, and into a chamber that smells like old velvet and diplomacy gone sour. This is where power used to clink in wine glasses and vanish behind drawn curtains, where deals were sealed not with handshakes but with nods too subtle for the casual observer. Venetian palaces weren't homes. They were status fortresses with salt water beneath them and skeletons in every closet. Not that anyone kept their secrets in closets back then, no. If you were a doge, a merchant prince, or just someone with enough coin and enemies, you carved your secrets into marble and disguised betrayal with architecture. And this room, with its looming portrait of a nobleman whose eyes never follow you but somehow always seem aware, is where whispers began, actual ones, not just gossip. Though Venice practically invented that too, historians still argue whether the acoustics of these halls were deliberately constructed to amplify soft voices or whether it was simply the result of heavy drapes and moisture-soaked stone, but for centuries guests claimed to hear murmurs while alone, half conversations in languages they couldn't place, drifting in from nowhere and always at ear height. The fringe theory you've heard by now is that water, acting like a memory sponge, absorbs voices and later leaks them out in droplets of sound, and in Venice where the sea floods even the basements and licks at the edges of every prayer, it's not too hard to believe that some voices got stuck. Your hand brushes the edge of a carved pillar as you walk, and you feel a groove that looks accidental but feels like a signature, and now you remember the tales of nobles disappearing not in grand drama, but quietly, without a trace except a pause mid-sentence and the eerie stillness of everyone pretending not to notice. Some say the walls absorbed them, that they spoke one last secret and became part of the building, and as absurd as it sounds, you pass a locked door with no handle, one that's always been there according to staff, though no one recalls seeing it open not once. Maybe behind it is a broom closet, maybe a confession chamber, maybe nothing at all. But tonight there's a whisper seeping through its seams and you can't make out words, only the sound, like a sigh of someone who knows they're being overheard. A soft laugh flickers through the hallway, not mocking, more surprised, and you realize this palace isn't empty, not entirely, or maybe you're just very tired. Mainstream history books will tell you that the power in Venice operated through a strange blend of bureaucracy, ritual, and ruthless social climbing, where families rose and fell in perfect silence, and looking around this palace you understand why walls so thick not even screams would carry, floors so polished the past might slip and fall trying to escape. The fringe crowd insists that this was by design, that the grandeur was meant to distract from how closely these spaces were monitored, not by guards but by tradition itself. And now as you trail your fingers along a velvet rope barring the next chamber, you feel the unmistakable pressure of being watched, not by eyes but by expectation. You lean into the room just a little and something brushes past your leg, something too fast to catch, like a breeze shaped like a person, and suddenly you regret being curious. This palace isn't haunted in the usual sense, it's haunted by choice, like the ghosts are here on invitation, and you, well, you're just passing through. Word count, 1048. You move through a narrow hall lined with tapestries, rich crimson threads wound into mythical beasts with glassy eyes and coiling tongues, and as you brush past them, they seem to rustle, not with movement, but with memory. The ceiling curves low here, like the palace is leaning in to listen, and with each step your boots make a soft slap against the stone, echoing farther than sound should travel in such tight quarters. This is the wing where guests used to sleep. Nobles and their entourages visiting from Florence or Lisbon or somewhere even farther flung, and if you believe the accounts, not all of them left through the front door. Venice had its own way of handling threats, rivals, or simply inconvenient personalities, and sometimes the elegant solution was to let a room swallow someone whole. A locked suite, an accidental fire, a fever that no one quite remembered catching. Historians still debate whether any of these disappearances were ever truly documented or whether they became legends simply because the palaces were so perfectly suited to hide the truth. But tonight you stand in that very corridor and the candles in the sconces dip low, as if exhaling after holding their breath too long. Fringe believers claim that noble guests were targeted specifically during masked balls, where identities blurred and someone could be led away, smiling, only to dissolve into the night. And you recall that one story, the masked woman who walked into a mirror and never emerged, her footsteps still heard in this wing though the floor's been relayed twice. You pass a door with no keyhole and behind it there's a faint waltz playing a scratchy, uneven rhythm like an old phonograph stuck in dream mode. And though no one lives in this wing anymore, there are fresh boot prints in the dust leading to that very door. You blink and they're gone, or maybe your brain's staging a protest against too much candlelight and not enough oxygen. Mainstream history prefers tales of feasts and diplomacy, of trade routes and spice fortunes, but that never explains why aristocrats sent letters saying send someone to fetch me. I think I've spoken to someone who's not alive, and even stranger, why those letters arrived months after the sender supposedly drowned. The hall ends in a chamber of mirrors, not reflective glass, but polished obsidian, warm to the touch and warped around the edges like it's been watching you for centuries, and as you step inside, your own breath sounds foreign, like someone else's sigh, the ceiling groans with age, and for a moment the quiet becomes overwhelming, like silence with intent. And you know you've walked straight into the space where whispers became legend, where gossip danced with ghosts, and where Venice decided what truths were worth keeping and which ones should vanish into the water. Word count, 1052. You descend a curved stone staircase lit only by oil lamps whose flames jitter like they're unsure whether to stay lit. This part of the palace feels older, more reluctant, and the walls here aren't marble or adorned with gilded cherubs, they're raw stone, damp in places, and layered with centuries of humidity and secrets that haven't yet dried out, and you can smell something faintly metallic. Not blood exactly, but close enough that you hesitate. This was once a servant's quarter, or so the official story goes, though mainstream historians admit there's very little record of who worked below the noble floors, and that absence itself is suspicious, especially in a city obsessed with documentation. Fringe researchers believe these stairwells and cellars doubled as holding rooms. Not just for wine and linens but for prisoners of influence, those who displeased the powerful without breaking any law you'd find in a textbook. And tonight your boots send echoes bouncing off cracked stones while something distant clicks, like fingernails tapping marble in impatience. You reach the bottom where 3 doors wait, one bolted, one ajar, and one missing entirely but leaving behind a black void that smells faintly of lavender and rot. And you remember the tale of the noble woman who supposedly vanished during a masked ball only to be heard sobbing for weeks afterward through the pipes in this very wing. Historians still argue whether she ever existed, or whether she was a composite of dozens who went missing under similar circumstances. But the one detail they can't seem to explain is why the oldest surviving blueprint of this palace shows an extra room that was never found, listed only as La Stanza Perduta, the lost chamber. You step toward the ajar door and it creaks open just enough to reveal a sliver of a room packed with portraits, hundreds of them stacked like dominoes, none in frames and all missing the lower half of their faces. Your flashlight flickers, briefly illuminating one figure whose eyes are stunningly lifelike, and for a second you swear those eyes look relieved, not because you found them, but because they found you. Fringe theory says Venetian artists sometimes painted the faces of those who didn't survive the palace walls, using pigment and egg tempera to trap their essence not in homage, but as confession, and this room feels like a gallery of guilt. You step back and the floor beneath you groans, not loudly, but just enough to make you feel like you're unwelcome, like your presence is cracking something old and fragile. And behind you the bolted door hums slightly, like someone behind it just leaned in to listen. You climb back upstairs, faster now, every torch flame bending subtly toward you as if exhaling in your direction, and as you emerge into the grand hallway again, the opulence feels thin, theatrical, like a mask about to slip. And you realize maybe that's the real purpose of these palaces, not to impress, but to distract, to make sure no one ever asks what's buried just beneath the silk. Word count, 1054. You step back into the hallway and notice that the light filtering through stained glass windows has changed, not dimmed, just shifted, the colors slightly colder, sharper around the edges, like the building itself has decided it's watching you more closely now. And though you swear you were just in one wing, the architecture no longer feels familiar. Ahead is a grand double door leading out to a narrow canal, its steps steep and slick with algae. And here the tales take on a briny, spectral quality. This is where fishermen and night gondoliers speak of ghost boats, phantom gondolas that drift without pilots beneath the waxing moon, whispering as they pass though no voices are heard, just the sound of ropes slapping water and oarlocks creaking. And you remember the story of the silver-eyed gondolier who vanished mid-route. His boat found gently bumping against the dock with no passenger and his last words echoing through a nearby tunnel. Historians still argue whether this boat ever existed, some insisting it was a metaphor spun by local writers, while others dig up shipping logs that show a vessel with no name docking repeatedly over the years, always at midnight and always during high tide. Fringe tales swirl around these ghost boats, suggesting they carry messages, snippets of conversation that were too dangerous to be spoken aloud, captured in the salt air and whispered along the water's edge long after their authors vanished into scandal or exile. You lean over the canal railing now and hear something odd, a low, steady hiss like breath but stretched unnaturally long, and the water below shifts without cause, forming brief, concentric rings like something unseen just passed through. Not beneath but within it, the scent of brine sharpens, and for a moment there's the unmistakable whiff of perfume, expensive, citrus-laced and clearly out of place beside the sour tang of algae and stone, and you glance behind but the hallway is empty except for a single black feather lying on the step. You pick it up and feel the texture of oil and old paper, and maybe your brain is patching symbols together now, but it reminds you of an ink quill. You step toward the dock. And the wood groans underfoot. At first the sound is simple physics, but then you realize it's rhythmic, patterned, almost conversational, like the boards themselves are knocking in code. Mainstream accounts of Venice's maritime legacy focus on trade, silk, spice, glass, but they never seem to explain why so many boatmen kept journals filled not with maps or cargo logs but poems and sketches of figures seen gliding silently on the canal, faces hidden, robes trailing in unnatural wind. And tonight you understand why those entries were never published. They weren't for anyone else, they were apologies or warnings, or both. You turn from the water's edge and start back toward the palace door, only to find it slightly ajar when you're sure you left it closed, and inside, the silence feels heavier now, less tranquil, more purposeful, like something followed you back and wants to hear what you'll do next. Word count, 1052. You tread carefully back through the main hall, now darker than before. The candles burned lower, the shadows stretching longer across the polished stone floor as if trying to trip you up and ahead. A narrow corridor curves downward, its edges damp and gleaming like something's been dragged through recently. This corridor wasn't on the map, and yet it feels familiar, like part of a dream you've had twice but only remember when you smell dust and salt in the same breath. And you recall the stories of noble families keeping secrets so heavy they couldn't be left at surface level. No, they had to be buried beneath velvet and silence, and that's exactly where this passage seems to lead. Historians still argue whether private crypts existed under Venetian homes at all, since most burial practices were controlled by the church. But fringe believers point to stories of hurried midnight funerals held not on land but on stone floors slick with spilled oil, where the cries of mourners were drowned by water slapping the walls outside. And one palace, this one, if the whispers are right, was said to hide a chamber filled with coffins too small to hold bodies, suggesting either ritual or something far worse. As you descend the curling steps, the air grows colder but not stale, scented with herbs, rosemary, lavender, something minty and sharp. And ahead, two lit lanterns cast golden circles on the floor, framing a doorway carved with runes no one's bothered to translate. And in this moment you understand why stories don't always get written down. Some truths were never meant to be repeated. You step inside and find yourself standing among pillars shaped like trees, their tops curling into stone leaves that seem to rustle as you move, and at the center of the room lies a raised slab marked with symbols that pulse faintly when touched, not visibly but beneath your fingers. Like soft electricity made of memory, this could be where the whispers originate, where breath gets tangled in stone and becomes legend, because the acoustics are impossible. One tap from your shoe echoes as though struck by thunder, and yet when you speak your own name, the sound disappears before reaching the far wall. Mainstream archaeologists dismiss such rooms as storage, or wine cellars, but fringe lore spins a darker tale: spaces built deliberately to hold grief, to contain betrayal, and to silence whoever couldn't be silenced above ground. You notice now that the walls are warm, not heated but somehow alive, like they've recently absorbed something. And from one corner, a whisper pushes through, soft, feminine, repeating one phrase in what sounds like Latin, or maybe Venetian dialect aged into shadow, and though the words aren't clear, the tone is unmistakable, pleading. You lean toward the sound and the floor vibrates slightly, as though you've stepped onto a sigh. And a sudden realization hits: you're not alone, not really, never were, not from the moment you touched the lion-headed knocker outside. And as you leave the crypt, its door swings closed on its own, not violently, just firmly, like someone wants to make sure it stays sealed until the next visitor is ready to listen. Word count, 1048. You exit the crypt with your breath shallow and your steps slower, not because you're tired, but because the palace seems to be watching how you walk now, gauging whether you're worthy of knowing more, or whether it's time to swallow you whole like it's done to so many others. And as you enter a sprawling gallery bathed in afternoon light that doesn't match the actual time, Your eyes land on a name etched delicately into the gold trim of a mirror, Ca. Dario. This is the palace that needs no introduction if you've spent more than 5 minutes with a local who enjoys terrifying tourists. The building infamous for its relentless bad luck, tragic deaths, and uncanny ability to ruin the lives of anyone who dared to own it, and you feel the shift immediately, not in temperature, but in mood. Like you've walked into a room where every argument and heartbreak was trapped inside the plaster like bubbles in old wine. Historians still argue whether the so-called Ca. Dario curse is mere coincidence after all. Rich people tend to have dramatic exits, but fringe theorists make long lists, cross-referencing ownership records with newspaper clippings full of terms like sudden, mysterious, and found alone. And you walk past a painting of a man with half-closed eyes whose face is familiar, though you've never seen it before. Legend says Ca. Dario's original architect died under bizarre circumstances, some say pushed from a gondola by invisible hands, others claim he simply vanished leaving only his reflection behind in the windows that seem too dark even in daylight. Tonight, your gaze catches one such pane, and inside it is not your face, but another, older, tired, and vaguely disappointed in you. Fringe lore claims this palace communicates through architecture itself, that each room rearranges slightly depending on who enters, and though you've walked in a straight line, you somehow end up back at the entrance with no memory of turning around. Whispers here are different, not speech but intent. You feel nudged, emotionally manipulated by spatial design. Like the staircase pulling you into thoughts that aren't yours and the rug beneath your feet vibrating with secrets older than language. One corner of the gallery displays a sculpture so lifelike that for years it was assumed to be a wax figure, and then someone noticed it aged, cracks forming along the cheeks and eyes drooping over decades, and now the question hangs unanswered: how does stone decay like skin? Mainstream tour guides avoid this wing entirely, citing structural issues and humidity, but if you ask the janitors, they'll tell you about the time a broom shattered by itself when left near the locked cellar door, or when someone's voice came out of the intercom system 6 hours after they'd left the country. Tonight, the palace hums, not loud but consistent, like it's pleased you stayed, and from one alcove a dry chuckle echoes, not cruel, just knowing, and you realize Ca. Dario doesn't hate its visitors, it chooses them. And once chosen, the only way out is silence. Word count, 1050. You follow a winding corridor lined with fading murals of mythical creatures and theatrical masks, their painted expressions caught mid-whisper, and ahead you hear what sounds like singing, not a full melody, more like fragments of an aria broken up by hesitation and breath. This is the part of the palace known for its connection to music, a wing that once hosted elite gatherings where sopranos soared and tenors trembled, and even today, when the windows are shut and the instruments packed away, the voices still linger like perfume clinging to velvet. You push open a door to reveal an empty stage. Candlelight flickers across red velvet seats, and you're struck by the strange sensation of being watched not by eyes, but by expectation, as if the room itself demands applause for a show that hasn't started in decades. Historians agree Venice was a center of music and performance, its opera houses rivaling those of Vienna and Paris. But they rarely mention the stories backstage where performers spoke of being guided by unseen hands or hearing their own warm-ups repeated in empty halls long after everyone else had gone home. Fringe enthusiasts swear that one singer, a woman with a voice like gold and wine, once vanished mid-performance only to be heard again years later. Same song, same mistake in the second verse, and her legend is said to haunt this very room, which still smells faintly of violets and brandy. Tonight, you walk onto the stage and the boards creak not under your weight, but like they're stepping for you, moving slightly in rhythm to your breath, and as you stand beneath a chandelier coated in centuries of dust, you hear it, a high note, sustained, wavering, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, and it's not terrifying, just deeply sad, like someone waiting for their cue that never came. You remember how sound travels differently in Venice. Echoes bounce off water, off stone softened by humidity, and here in this palace, whispers slip through cracks and multiply, sometimes louder than shouts. Mainstream guides chalk it all up to acoustics, but fringe theory suggests these buildings are tuned like instruments, each room responding to certain frequencies, to certain emotions, and tonight this stage responds to yours, humming faintly as if warming up for a finale that hasn't been written. You step back and the song fades. replaced by silence so pure it almost feels loud, and that's when you notice a solitary chair on the far side of the room carved with the initials M.D. Its fabric worn, and as you approach you realize it's warmer than the rest of the room, and under its cushion, tucked like a secret, is a sheet of music with one note circled in red off-key, perhaps, or just wrong in a way that implies it wasn't meant for human ears. You leave the chair and the lights flicker in a ripple, like curtains closing on someone's favorite memory, and outside, the corridor feels colder now. Not because of ghosts, but because something or someone just finished their performance. Word count, 1048. You step out of the music wing and the shift is immediate. Less velvet, more velvet-covered bookshelves, the air thicker now with salt and aged paper as if the building just turned a page in its mood, and here is where the 19th century obsession with spiritualism took hold like mildew on the marble. Seances lit by flickering whale oil lamps and half-believed prayers whispering across tarot cards spread on silver platters. This chamber hosted occultists, aristocrats, poets with too many feelings and not enough logic, all convinced they could coax the spirits of drowned lovers and forgotten saints from the lagoon with nothing more than incense and dramatic Latin. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were elaborate theater or genuine attempts at supernatural diplomacy, and fringe thinkers lean toward the latter, citing diaries where guests claimed the spirits spoke not in words but in sudden drafts and flickering flame shapes that mirrored sorrowful gestures. Tonight you approach a low table surrounded by peeling red divans, the velvet crusted with the impressions of too many restless knees, and in the center sits a dusty crystal ball ridiculously clitch but somehow magnetic, and beside it, a copper bowl still smelling faintly of burnt sage, clove, and something sweet like orange peel left out too long. You glance at the ceiling where the plaster domes outward like the inside of a skull, and some say this room was deliberately shaped to mimic a brain, to channel thought into voice and voice into memory, and maybe it worked, because fringe lore insists this space could summon any feeling you wanted, and tonight it's conjuring curiosity. Tinged with dread, there's a small wooden box on the mantel marked Voces Latin for voice, and inside it, a locket with a miniature portrait and a note folded so tight you hesitate to open it, fearing the words might leap out like insects when you finally do. It reads, "He never arrived, but he whispered through the walls," and beneath the handwriting is a smudge shaped like a teardrop or a thumbprint. You're not sure which. Mainstream historians attribute the rise of Venetian occult salons to a mix of boredom, wealth, and the rise of print culture feeding people ghost stories like bedtime snacks, but they can't explain why some guests had identical dreams years apart, or why a psychic reportedly spoke perfect Croatian despite never leaving Italy or studying the language. Tonight, you light one of the ancient candles and the room flickers like it's trying to remember itself. And from behind a curtain, something small clatters, a bead, a key, maybe a loose marble with secrets etched in its curves. You don't reach for it, not out of fear, but out of respect for whatever this place chooses to share. And as you leave the room, the candle dims on its own, like someone decided the essence is over for now. Word count, 1049. You walk down a marble hallway whose surface is so polished it reflects not just your feet but a second set, faint and slightly offset like someone's shadow without the someone, and ahead looms a door inlaid with shards of deep blue glass Murano, unmistakably, and around it the walls ripple with warped reflections, as if the palace itself is remembering something it doesn't want to say aloud. Inside is the workshop of a reclusive glassmaker who, according to local legend, spoke only to the furnaces and claimed his creations whispered back. Mainstream historians confirm Murano was Venice's crown jewel of artisan fame, known for centuries of dazzling glasswork, but the fringe stories are far stranger, involving a man who lived alone for decades, crafting chandeliers so delicate they shattered under moonlight, and one mirror rumored to reflect not truth but regrets. You step inside and the air shivers, the kind of cold that doesn't touch your skin but slices straight through the part of you that doubts anything spooky could be real, and the walls are lined with unfinished projects, vases twisted like vines mid-scream, goblets so fragile they look like they're trying not to exist, and a single sculpture of a woman whose eyes are made of liquid glass that somehow never hardened. It's said the artist went mad, not screaming, frothing mad, but a quiet madness, like forgetting you're real and remembering you're watched. And according to fringe lore, one of his final pieces contained actual whispers, trapped between folds of molten glass and cooled so slowly that the voices never burned away. Tonight, a soft clink echoes behind you and a chandelier swings though there's no draft, and you know deep down that someone used to work here late into the night, listening. Not just to the crackle of flame but to whatever spoke through it. Historians still debate whether the glassmaker's isolation was due to personal tragedy, financial ruin, or supernatural obsession, and a few letters remain describing his belief that colors could carry emotion so intense it might influence thought, that blue made people mourn and red made them confess. Which may explain why this room pulses with shifting hues that don't reflect from any light source you can find. You step toward the mirror he never finished, covered in fingerprints that aren't yours and swirling so deeply you feel like if you stare too long, it'll stare back, and for a moment your reflection blinks before you do, not in menace, but in warning. On a shelf sits a single flute made of twisted glass, delicate and slightly bent at one end where lips must have pressed centuries ago. And without thinking you lift it, and although you don't blow, a sound resonates from inside, high, thin, mournful, like the echo of something broken long ago but still trying to sing. You leave the room slowly, careful not to bump any table or disturb any dust, but as you close the door behind you, every shard of glass in the hallway captures a sliver of your face and none of them match. You ascend a narrow spiral staircase, the kind that wasn't built for comfort but for secrecy. Its steps uneven, worn down in the middle like they've hosted centuries of quiet urgency, and as you climb, the distant sound of rushing water pulses beneath your feet as though the whole palace is breathing through the plumbing. The room you reach is small, tucked behind a heavy tapestry frayed at the edges and embroidered with gold that started to tarnish in places that suspiciously resemble fingerprints, and inside, the acoustics are wrong in the way that sound bounces off the walls and returns to you slightly slower, like it had to remember your voice before replying. Historians still argue whether these strange sonic anomalies are due to the age of the materials or some forgotten design principle used by Venetian architects to manipulate space, but fringe thinkers swear it's the tide, that the ever-creeping lagoon soaks into the walls and reanimates sound long after it's spoken. Which might explain why you're suddenly hearing two versions of yourself, your footsteps now and your footsteps 5 seconds ago. You walk past a carved stone bench and the floor beneath it is wet, not soaked, just slightly damp in a pattern too regular to be accidental, and the walls, though solid, hum like they're made of something hollow, like wood pretending to be marble, and you begin to suspect this part of the palace isn't entirely real. It's an echo of architecture, maintained not by brick but by belief. As you peer closer at the walls, small cracks reveal dark patches beneath the stucco, patches that shimmer briefly like oil on water, and when you place your palm against the wall, it feels warmer than the air, pulsing, faintly rhythmic, like something behind it is moving, and the whisper that rises through your hand is unintelligible but oddly soothing. Like being told a story in a language you once dreamt of knowing. You step back and notice a carving beside the bench, 3 lines of uneven symbols, etched hastily as if by someone who didn't have time to be elegant, and as you run your finger over the grooves, one of them flares cold, then vanishes, as if waking up just to say goodbye. Mainstream history calls this room La Sala di Riflessione, the room of reflection, but the reflection isn't visual, it's auditory. And fringe theory insists this place was built to trap whispers, to contain betrayal and guilt so they'd echo endlessly until finally forgiven. Tonight, you hear no voice, but you do hear rhythm, soft tapping, like a finger against a goblet, and with each beat your pulse sinks to it involuntarily, like your body recognizing a melody it can't name. You leave the room slowly, and as you descend the spiral staircase, the sound follows, lighter now, almost playful, and when you reach the main hall again, one of the distant tapestries sways on its own, not wildly, but subtly enough to remind you that sound, once spoken, is never truly gone in Venice. It rests, waits, and whispers back when it's ready. You drift into a quieter wing now, one lined not with tapestries or chandeliers but shelves, endless shelves packed with books so old their titles have faded into anonymity, and the scent here isn't musty or stale, but strangely sharp, like citrus left out near ink. And as you step across the threshold, there's a thick stillness that greets you, the kind found only in libraries long forgotten yet never abandoned. This was once the private reading room of a Venetian noble who, according to both official records and unverified rumor, simply never died, not dramatically or spiritually, just administratively missing, his name scratched from censuses but preserved in footnotes, and fringe lore insists he still catalogues these books, rearranging them in order not of title or genre, but mood, and as you run your finger across the spine of a crimson volume labeled Doubt, the candle beside it flickers like it's reconsidering your presence. Historians still argue whether this noble existed at all or whether he was invented by a later generation of caretakers to explain why every attempt to digitize the collection failed, why cameras malfunctioned in this room, and why some books couldn't be opened unless you felt a certain way, guilty, hopeful, or afraid. Tonight, you pass a tall, arched window that shouldn't be there. It looks out onto a blank wall just a few feet beyond, yet through the glass you see mist drifting like the canal found a way into the palace's soul, and in that haze, a figure sits at a desk, unmoving, feather quill raised but not writing, as though waiting for permission. You turn away and the shelves creak, not dangerously, just conversationally, and you remember hearing about the book that returned itself, one bound in gray leather with no title. Found lying on a desk that hadn't been touched in a century, open to a page that read "He listens when you don't speak." Mainstream guides skip this wing entirely, calling it structurally unstable, which might be true, but doesn't explain why every recorded attempt to renovate this space resulted in workers reporting faint voices listing names that hadn't appeared in any roster since 1789. Fringe thinkers suggest the library isn't haunted but alive, functioning more like a sentient archive, where the books rearrange themselves based on the reader and certain doors appear only when needed. And tonight, as you reach for a slim volume of poetry, one such door opens in the far corner, just wide enough to show a staircase descending into shadow, and beside it, a sign etched in what might be gold leaf or bone reads, "Do not disturb the cataloger." You take one last breath of ink and quiet before stepping out, and the moment you do, the door shuts with a soft click, leaving only the scent of old pages and the lingering sense that your presence was logged in a book you'll never see. You ease into a side chamber dimly lit by a single candle flickering inside a hand-blown glass cage, the kind designed not to illuminate but to confuse shadows, and the first thing you hear is a low growl, not from a beast but from memory itself, as this was once the private quarters of a noble family known for opulence and quiet scandal. But what made the space infamous wasn't the whispered affairs or forged documents, it was the dogs, dozens of them kept indoors. Not for protection but allegedly to detect what the eye couldn't see. Mainstream records acknowledge that Venetian elites often kept lapdogs and sighthounds as status symbols, but fringe accounts suggest these pets were more than companions, they were alarm systems trained to bark at things humans preferred to ignore. And tonight the room carries their echo, a yipping laugh followed by scratching from behind the paneling, rhythmic, deliberate, like claws measuring time. You pass a velvet chaise that looks freshly sunk into despite years of abandonment, and beside it lies a porcelain bowl with water that ripples though the air is still. And suddenly you remember that curious archive entry, a maid who reported the family poodle staring at an empty chair and growling for 15 straight minutes while its fur stood on end like someone brushed it backward with static. Historians still argue whether these reactions were natural instinct or responses to environmental shifts, air pressure, mold, but the stories often include dogs refusing to enter certain rooms, growling at corners, or whimpering as if someone whispered instructions they couldn't disobey. Fringe lore suggests one palace tried to train its pets to communicate with ghosts directly, using treat-based reinforcement whenever a bark aligned with a flickering candle or disembodied knock. And tonight, near a cracked column, you spot a leash, frayed, blue silk, looped neatly but somehow sad, like it misses what it once restrained. You sit briefly in the armchair nearest the fireplace and a gust of cold brushes your ankles. No breeze, just sensation, and the bark that erupts next isn't yours, it's distant, ghostly, echoed 3 times by nothing but the stone. And as you rise, that same ripple disturbs the water bowl again, this time forming a shape not round, but stretched as if something leaned in for a drink and left behind just its reflection. You cross the room and notice faint claw marks beside the door frame, not threatening, more like notches made by a dog waiting too long for someone who never returned. And suddenly the room feels less haunted by spirits than by longing, the kind that animals carry silently when words would only complicate grief. As you exit, the candle stutters and a final bark trails behind you, not loud, not afraid, but patient, as if waiting still. You slip into the next chamber, and the first sensation is scent layers of roses, sandalwood, and something sharper, more artificial, like perfume that's aged too well, and hanging in the air is a sweetness that doesn't come from flowers but memory. This was the bridal room, allegedly, reserved for women promised into noble unions arranged more for politics than love. And as you pass a gilded vanity with its mirror cracked straight down the center, the perfume deepens, rich and tragic. Like emotion bottled and left to ferment, mainstream historians describe these spaces as decorative holdings, rooms meant to impress visiting dignitaries or idle cousins with taste, but fringe theorists speak of the vanishing brides, a cycle of young women who entered these palaces full of hope only to vanish without scandal, without fanfare, without explanation, and tonight you spot a white glove on the floor near the fireplace. Trimmed in pearls and slightly curled inward like the hand it once wrapped around. Left in a hurry, you tread carefully and see a set of footprints bare, faint, pressed into the dust toward a faded green curtain swaying without breeze, and behind it, you swear there's a second layer of wallpaper, older, darker, printed with vines that don't grow on this continent and tiny eyes hidden within petals. Fringe lore insists these rooms were infused with emotion so potent it left echoes. Not of voice but feeling. And when heartbreak happened here, and it did often, it lingered longer than the furniture, imprinting sorrow into the fabric so deeply that guests would cry without knowing why. You recall that one account, a woman sent to marry into a wealthy Venetian clan vanished before the ceremony, leaving only her slippers and a note that read, "I followed the voice that knew my name," and the legend says you can still hear it, faint and warm, calling through stone as if inviting a final walk. You pass a bouquet crumbled into dust but still pungent, and suddenly the air thickens, not with sadness, but presence, like someone just leaned in to check your reaction, and from the vanity mirror, a flicker, brief, pale, shaped like a shoulder wrapped in lace. You back away instinctively and notice on the edge of the table a silver comb carved with initials you don't recognize, resting beside a music box that clicks softly and begins to play just a few notes, just once, then silence. Historians still argue whether the bridal disappearances were real or literary invention, Venetian melodrama spun by bored scribes, but this room feels like an answer no one wanted, and as you leave, the perfume follows, fading slowly, as if hoping you'll come back to finish a story that's still waiting in the dust. You enter a side corridor that curves unnaturally left before right, a kind of architectural misdirection that makes even seasoned locals feel like they've walked into someone else's memory. And here, the walls are closer together, the air tighter, and the floor slick in places with more than just damp. This passage leads toward the canal-facing wing of the palace, the side least accessible by land and most whispered about in old taverns where boatmen lowered their voices mid-sentence and swore that the water carried more than tide. Historians still argue whether the canal murders ever truly happened or whether they were stitched together from unrelated accidents, drownings, and the occasional political erasure. But fringe accounts claim noble families used the canals as escape routes for secrets that couldn't be buried in cemeteries or locked in vaults. And some bodies were never retrieved, not because they were lost, but because they were deliberately forgotten. You pause at a window where the stone is stained darker than the rest, streaked like something heavy was dragged beneath it, and below, the water laps quietly as if trying to hush a story that's about to wake up again. Inside, on the wall, hangs a tapestry of two figures, one masked, one veiled, leaning over a gondola full of roses, and beneath it, a plaque without text. Only a small mark resembling an open eye. Fringe lore says certain families encoded messages in art, that flowers often symbolized murder and masks disguised guilt as grace, and here, among rose-patterned trim and suspiciously symmetrical tear stains in the fabric, you start to understand the story nobody tells, that whispers began not as ghostly moans but as confession spoken to water, in hopes it would never echo them back. The corridor ends at a stone arch marked with initials you can't quite read, maybe worn down over time, or maybe never intended to be legible, and above it hangs a lantern unlit, dust-covered, but still warm at its base as if someone passed by minutes ago. Mainstream records of Venetian aristocracy rarely delve into the unspoken chapters of family legacy, but the fringe crowd knows better. They say these walls keep a ledger not of money, but of silence. And tonight, as you brush your hand against the stone, something pulses beneath it, not fast, not aggressive, just rhythmic, like a memory being counted instead of erased, and you remember the boatman's tale of seeing soft candlelight drift beneath the water's surface as if a gondola had sunk but never stopped moving, its oars still slicing moonlight into ripples of regret. You turn to leave and the corridor exhales a low, wet breath like the stone itself had held its tongue until now. And as you step back into the wider hall, the shadows stretch to meet you, not as threats, but as witnesses. You find yourself drifting toward a quiet suite tucked away behind an alcove, its walls lined with velvet so deep red it borders on black, and as you brush your hand against the fabric, something clicks beneath your fingers. A compartment opens, revealing a shallow drawer filled with heirlooms, each wrapped in silk and humming faintly with significance. These aren't ordinary trinkets, they're keepsakes with reputations, rumored to carry curses more consistent than the tides. And as you unwrap one, a brooch shaped like a serpent devouring its own tail, you feel a jolt, not painful but precise, as if the object recognized you. Mainstream historians acknowledge Venice's obsession with lineage and opulence, but often skip the darker tales of inheritance where gifts doubled as warnings and jewels seem to change hands only after calamity. Fringe scholars speak of cursed heirlooms passed deliberately, wrapped not for safekeeping but containment, and this drawer, is full of such things: a locket said to cause hallucinations when worn too long, a pair of gloves embroidered with initials no one admits owning, and a mirror so small it only reflects what you've lost. Tonight, the silence here is rich with memory. You swear the temperature shifts when you pick up a cameo depicting two faces, and as you turn it over, the inscription reads, "A love divided is love denied." Which is dramatic even for Venice but somehow feels directed. You sit briefly on the edge of a chaise where the upholstery scratches your skin through clothing like it's searching for a story, and near the armrest, etched in fading gold leaf, you find a single word: Judizio, judgment. Fringe lore insists some palaces maintained rooms just for heirlooms too dangerous to destroy and too significant to keep close. And guests would be brought here to choose one not for fashion but fate, and what they picked determined everything from marriage prospects to health. And tonight you wonder if you've chosen anything at all or if something chose you. Historians still debate whether Venetian families believed in these curses or simply enjoyed the theater of consequence, but as you wrap the brooch back in its silk, the drawer refuses to close, hanging open slightly like an invitation left unanswered. And behind you, the velvet shifts only a few centimeters, but enough to reveal another drawer, deeper, darker, containing nothing but a folded letter written in mirror script and sealed with wax shaped like a crying eye. You don't open it, not because you fear it, but because somehow you know it's not for you, at least not yet. And as you leave the room, your reflection in the hallway mirror blinks one breath behind you, waiting to see what you'll inherit next. You step into a low-lit vestibule where the floor patterns seem to ripple even though nothing moves, and the air smells like varnish and tired leather, the kind that clings to old coats and damp diaries. And ahead, propped against a marble column, leans a solitary gondolier's oar, cracked at the grip and etched with unfamiliar symbols that pulse slightly when touched. This space isn't a room in the traditional sense, it's a resting nook, built not for comfort but for confession. And the legend of the gondolier who refused to row begins here. Historians still debate whether he ever existed. Some claim he was a composite of many surly locals fed up with superstitious tourists, while others swear they spoke with him, his voice gravelly and slow, full of riddles and warnings that never made sense until it was too late. Fringe stories go further, insisting this man didn't age, didn't sleep, and rode only under fog so thick you couldn't see his boat until it touched yours. And tonight, as you stand beside his oar, the wall beside you thumps softly, one knock, then three, spaced like a pattern, and in the silence that follows you hear breath, but not yours. You turn and find a tattered cloak hanging from a hook carved into a lion's mouth beneath it, boots soaked through though the floor is dry, and a wax paper envelope with a single strand of silver hair tucked inside, still warm. This gondolier, according to lore, didn't ferry souls but stories. Steering away from palazzos where secrets became dangerous and toward quieter waters where memories dissolved. Mainstream guides mention him briefly, usually with a wink and a shrug, but fail to explain the journal entries left by guests who described encountering him twice, once alive, and once in a reflection where his eyes didn't match. You sit briefly on a bench carved from driftwood and feel a sudden motion, like your seat rocks slightly in rhythm to the tide outside. And you realize this part of the palace might be moored differently, not to stone, but to myth, and something in the corner stirs, not with sound but shape, as if a shadow folded itself away before being seen. Fringe theory holds that ghost gondoliers whisper not with voice but intention, guiding travelers toward truth they're too afraid to admit, and those who listen well might be spared from the worst of the palace's mood swings. As you rise, the air thickens briefly, scented with wood smoke and pepper, familiar, calming, but unmistakably out of place, and the door shudders once where it leans, as if resisting being left alone, and when you exit the vestibule, the echo that follows isn't yours but it knows your name. You step into a narrow chamber tucked behind a false wall, its entrance partially hidden by an ornate tapestry depicting lions chasing shadows, and inside, the air turns distinctly dry despite the dampness you've grown accustomed to in the rest of the palace. This room is colder, though not with ghostly chill, with the kind of hush that suggests something sacred or forbidden, and as your eyes adjust to the gloom, you notice the fireplace, wide, shallow. Its mantel lined not with family photos or carved cherubs, but with urns, each small, unmarked, and somehow familiar, and the scent in the air isn't smoke, but ash, old and faint, like someone tried to forget by burning, but the memory clung to the stone anyway. Historians rarely speak of cremation in Venetian palaces, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't supposed to. Church doctrine favored burial, and cremation was taboo, whispered about only in scandal and secret. But fringe scholars insist some noble families chose to reduce shame to dust rather than let it rot above ground, and tonight, you're in a chamber rumored to hide the remains of not enemies or strangers, but unspoken grief, miscarried children, scandalous lovers, disgraced bloodlines, ashes swept into the hearth and hidden behind intricate ironwork. You step closer and see a small indentation near the base of the fireplace, where the soot has been disturbed in a pattern, a circle crossed by a line, like someone drew it repeatedly until the stone gave in, and beside it sits a single piece of parchment, faded and brittle, with a name written over and over and over, and none of them match each other. The silence here isn't empty, it's expectant, and you begin to feel watched not by eyes, but by memory itself, like the room is remembering every word spoken inside it, replaying them for no one and everyone. Mainstream historians call these odd spaces utility alcoves or service nooks, but their location, decoration, and the unmistakable presence of ritual speak louder than classification. And tonight you notice an inscription beneath the mantel, carved into the marble so lightly it's almost invisible unless touched. What we burned was not forgotten, it was invited home. And suddenly, behind you, the floor creaks not with footsteps but with weight shifting, slowly, deliberately, and you resist turning around because part of you knows this isn't a space for confrontation, it's a space for silence and respect. As you exit, the air warms slightly, just at your shoulders, and the ash in the corner swirls briefly before settling again, like breath returned to stillness. You continue down a corridor that feels oddly theatrical. The arches overhead curve like stage curtains frozen mid-rise, and the air carries that peculiar blend of wax and incense that clings to places of old worship. And as you turn a corner, the ceiling lowers, narrowing into a vaulted chamber that smells of candle smoke and faint wine. And here begins the tale of the Laughing Bishop of Santa Maria, a story dismissed by most historians as local folklore but clung to by fringe believers with fervent insistence. Mainstream accounts of Venice's clergy in the 16th century note the bishop was respected, brilliant, and fond of sermons so vivid they drew gasps, but fringe versions claim that during his final service, as thunder roared and a candle flickered out mid-prayer, the bishop laughed, not a chuckle, but a full-bodied, echoing laugh that rippled through the church like a stone tossed into velvet. And ever since then, visitors to his former quarters report hearing that same laugh in moments of solitude, particularly during storms. Tonight, you find yourself in that exact chamber, where the wallpaper is faded in places that suspiciously match where furniture once stood, and in the far corner sits a dusty armchair with an open missal resting on its seat, pages curled as if they were recently turned. You step closer and the silence shifts, not broken, just reshaped, as if something in the room adjusted to make space for you. And when you reach for the book, a soft breeze touches the back of your neck, though all windows are shut, and the laugh, brief, light, maybe imagined, floats past your left ear with just enough clarity to make you question your own posture. Fringe lore suggests the bishop didn't laugh because of madness or mockery. but revelation that he glimpsed something beyond the veil of ritual and found it utterly hilarious, and the theory goes that his ghost remains here not to haunt, but to amuse, tickled forever by the gap between solemnity and human nonsense. As you lean against the mantel, you notice the carvings, faces, 12 of them, each unique, but every one smiling. And beneath the center face a small plaque reads Riddens in Perpetuum Laughing Forever, and you begin to wonder if this chamber isn't sacred because of what was taught here, but because of what was understood. Historians still argue over the authenticity of the laugh. Some say it's wind funneled oddly through narrow pipes, others that it's psychological suggestion based on the chamber's acoustics, but the fact remains. People leave this room unnerved, not from fear, but from feeling like they missed the punchline of a cosmic joke. Tonight, as you exit, the laughter returns softer this time, more like a breath through a smile, and whatever its source, it's not mocking, just amused that you're still searching. You move into a narrow passageway, its ceiling lower than expected, forcing your posture into a gentle bow that feels ceremonial even if unintended, and here the floor shifts from marble to smooth stone etched faintly with symbols that repeat themselves: circles, triangles, and marks resembling falling feathers. And ahead, beyond an iron gate left slightly ajar, lies the infamous Bridge of Sighs, its twin archways visible through a tall window. Cloaked in mist that thickens strangely when you blink too slow, this chamber is tied to wishes and warnings, where coins were tossed not with hope but urgency, and the legends tell of visitors flinging tokens into water while whispering secrets too dangerous to write. Some swore their coin never sank, others claimed their wish arrived true but twisted. Historians still argue whether these tossing rituals were rooted in ancient superstition or began as a merchant's prank turned cultural norm. But fringe accounts go deeper, suggesting certain coins acted like offerings, bribes to the unseen, requests that came with a cost always paid in echo. Tonight, beside a shallow basin set into the wall, you spot 2 corroded copper coins resting still despite the slight breeze, and carved above them is a phrase in near faded Latin: Quid vult solvitur, what it wants will be paid for. You lean against the sill, watching the water below, and hear not the usual lapping but a soft clink, metal on metal from somewhere beneath the bridge, rhythmic and deliberate. And suddenly the shadows along the arch pulse just slightly, as if shrugging off weight. Fringe tales speak of cursed lovers who made their final pact with a coin toss, vanishing into mist with nothing left behind but the echo of laughter or tears. And the bridge itself, its history mixed with romance and execution, is said to sigh only when someone watches too closely, its breath caught in stone just long enough to shift the course of a life. You turn from the window and the corridor darkens, not with light fading but with pressure building, the kind felt behind your eyes when a storm arrives unannounced. And as you pass an alcove marked with the initials V.D., your own pulse quickens in sync with a soft tapping. Once, twice, pause, then once again, and you remember the tale of the woman who dropped a coin but heard her name whispered before it hit water, and when she leaned over the edge to look, the wind pushed back gently, but firmly, like hands returning her to safety or denying her from knowing more. Mainstream narratives about Venetian bridges focus on structure and history, but the people who live here know that crossing isn't always transportation, it's transformation. And as you walk away, one of the coins in the wall basin rattles slightly, spinning twice in place before settling with its face down, like a secret reconsidering its silence. You step into a gallery with dust-lined floors and curtains so thick they drink the light, and across the room a grand staircase leads nowhere, just upward into shadow, like someone gave up building it when they realized where it ended. And beside its base stands a tall grandfather clock, unmoving, its pendulum frozen mid-swing like it's still waiting for permission to complete a thought. This wing belonged to Ca. Resenico, a palace known for hosting extravagant evenings, but remembered more quietly for one guest who never left, a woman of aristocratic lineage who walked these halls at midnight, wrapped in blue velvet, her footsteps soft but unmistakable. And according to fringe lore, those footsteps continue even now, recorded in the stone itself, replayed for anyone quiet enough to notice. Historians still argue whether the stories are fabrication or fact, noting that records of the Resenico family's estate became inconsistent near the end of the 18th century, with mentions of unsettled rooms and lingering presences that were never defined. But tonight, as you climb the stairs toward the chamber she once preferred, the air thickens not with fear, but anticipation, and halfway up you hear it, the faint brush of fabric, the press of a heel, and though no one appears, the scent of lavender settles into the folds of your sleeve like she walked past. You reach a landing with a single window overlooking the canal, its glass fogged despite the warm air. And in that fog you see movement, not definite shapes, but gestures, a hand lifting, a head turning, an elegant nod meant for someone not standing beside you. Fringe accounts describe this woman as tragic, powerful, and deeply lonely, a figure who spoke more to shadows than guests, and some say she died mid-conversation, her voice swallowed by the palace itself. Now trickling into the halls every night in search of someone willing to reply, you pass a mirror layered in dust and faint fingerprints, 5 tall, 1 small, as if someone pressed a hand and a single finger before stepping away, and on its edge sits a hairpin carved with forget-me-nots, blue enamel faded, but still vivid where it mattered. Mainstream historians dismiss the idea of a resident ghost, preferring practical explanations: settling floors, wind pressure, echoes. But the caretakers know better. They leave a candle lit each night in her room, never trimming the wick, never moving the holder, and claim the flame dances differently than anywhere else in the building. Tonight, as you step back down the stairs, one board creaks that hadn't on the way up, and from the hallway behind you, the faint scent of lavender follows, patient, practiced, and still hoping you'll stay just a moment longer. You slip through a narrow arch into a space that feels suspended outside of time, its walls blotched with faded frescoes and its ceiling curved like the dome of a half-forgotten chapel, and in the center stands a dueling platform, low and polished, ringed by candles that haven't been lit in a century but still smell faintly of beeswax and iron. This was where honor met vanity, where masked nobles settled scores too delicate for public shame yet too severe for silence. And the ghost stories here aren't tragic, they're vengeful, full of whispered steel and vanished apologies. Historians still argue whether formal duels occurred inside Venice's palaces at all, given the city's codes against violence and preference for public decorum. But fringe tales refuse subtlety. They speak of midnight challenges signed with dried blood and delivered by gondola, of secret witnesses bound by silence and threats, and of opponents who fought not with skill but with desperation disguised as flair. Tonight, you stand on that very floor, where the marble still shows faint indentations, 2 circles, opposing, evenly spaced like ritual choreography, and the air buzzes softly, like sound layered with intent, and suddenly you hear it, the scrape of boots, the whisper of silk, and a single breath release just before a lunge. You step back instinctively, though there's no one visible. And from the corner of the room a cold draft brushes your sleeve as though someone just walked past in haste, too proud to stay still, too dishonored to fade gently. Fringe lore claims this chamber replays its history, not through vision or sound but tension. You walk here and the mood shifts, the temperature climbs, your heartbeat sinks with something that wants retribution but doesn't yet know your name. And the scent of sweat and leather lingers though everything around you is pristine. On the far wall hangs a tapestry folded awkwardly, like someone tried to hide the image. A pair of figures, swords raised, one smiling and one weeping, and beneath them a phrase stitched in gold thread: honorem sine pace, honor without peace. Mainstream guides skip this space, citing restricted access or ongoing restoration, but behind closed doors, caretakers admit they hear taps on this floor late at night, and candles on the mantel shift position by morning, as if someone tried to mark time mid-duel. Tonight, you lean against the platform and feel the marble pulse once beneath your palm, not violently, not urgently, just enough to suggest that someone once made a promise here, and that it was never fulfilled. You step through a narrow doorway framed by heavy silk curtains, one drawn half back like someone stepped through and never finished the gesture, and inside the room it's quieter than any space you've entered yet, not silent, but muffled, like sound here is folded, pressed between layers of sentiment, and you notice immediately the abundance of paper, letters stacked in boxes, tucked into shelves, pinned delicately onto cork boards as if someone tried to organize emotion into file systems. Historians acknowledge Venice's long tradition of correspondence, poetry, diplomacy, affairs, but fringe believers point to rooms like this, where the letters never made it past these walls, written in ink that still glistens despite the age and sealed with wax as if their senders hoped someone would one day read what they never dared to send. Tonight, the room smells faintly of cedar and old roses. And on one desk lies a single envelope marked "Perch non-respondi." Why don't you answer? And beside it, A lock of hair bound with thin ribbon faded to almost transparency. Fringe lore insists certain palaces held correspondence chambers, where guests would pour out grief or longing to spirits rather than humans, and one alcove here glows faintly around a letter etched into glass rather than paper. Its message scratched backward so only someone standing at the perfect angle could read. I waited at midnight, but your promise drowned. The room feels heavy, not oppressive but saturated, and each drawer you pass hums like it remembers every emotion ever tucked inside it, and at your feet a piece of parchment lies folded into a heart, brittle but somehow intact, and when you pick it up, the crease emits a faint sigh, no breeze. Just sentiment releasing itself from shape. Mainstream guides call these letters decorative artifacts, but caretakers know better, their inherited grief, and touching them is like momentarily wearing someone else's regret, and as you move toward the exit, the scent changes, now sharper, like citrus and salt water, and in the far corner of the room sits a small ink-stained chair that wasn't there before, and on its cushion a fresh envelope sealed with black wax and addressed simply to you. If you listen, you don't open it, not tonight, but you understand what it means. Some love stories never needed readers, only witnesses. You step into a final corridor, narrower than the others, its walls curved inward like the palace itself is exhaling, and ahead is a door with peeling gold leaf and a brass handle shaped like a flame caught mid-dance, and the plaque above it reads Archivio d'Ombra, the Archive of Shadows. Historians aren't sure this room ever officially existed, its location unlisted on blueprints and often forgotten during restoration tours. But fringe explorers have long whispered of a space where stories not written down are kept anyway, a vault for moments undocumented, truths denied, memories erased with intention. Inside, the air is hushed like the inside of a theater just before the curtain rises, and the walls are lined with drawers too shallow for books yet too ornate to ignore, and each bears a small emblem, a tooth, a feather, a tear, a flame, as if each one catalogues emotion rather than fact. Tonight, you pull open one such drawer and inside lies only a scrap of velvet stitched with the phrase "he said he'd return, but his echo arrived instead," and beside it, a single glass bead warm to the touch, humming faintly as though absorbing your breath. Fringe theorists believe this archive listens more than it stores, responding to the presence of guests by surfacing artifacts that mirror their mood, and from the far side of the room, a shelf tilts forward slightly, revealing a cracked lantern housing not a candle, but a folded note with your birthdate etched in its edge. Though you've never been here before, you step closer, and the lantern flickers not with light, but with shadow, projecting soft shapes against the wall, a hand waving, a mask falling, a staircase descending into water, and suddenly the palace's stories begin to braid themselves into feeling, suggesting that every ghost wasn't someone lost, but someone listened to too late. Historians who hear of this room dismiss it as myth, a metaphor for grief or an allegory for secrets, but the caretakers speak gently when asked. They say the archive is where the building itself remembers what people forget, that if you linger long enough, it'll show you something you didn't know you lost. Tonight, as you prepare to leave, one drawer slides open by itself, revealing a mirror no bigger than a coin. And in its surface you see a flicker, your own face, yes, but with different eyes. Calmer, older, and just slightly relieved, you close the drawer and step out, and the door behind you latches gently without touch, sealing away one more whisper never meant for history, only for presence. You return to the central atrium of the palace, that vast, echoing heart where all corridors eventually bleed, where the mosaic floor swirls with glass patterns that look like currents and constellations stitched together by someone who knew geometry but preferred poetry. It's quiet here now, quieter than when you began, and yet somehow more alive, the kind of hush that comes when a story pauses for breath, rather than ends. The chandeliers overhead no longer shimmer, but pulse gently with the rhythm of your steps, and in the center of the atrium rests a table with 4 chairs, all facing inward and arranged not for conversation but reflection, and on its surface sits a heavy tome, leather-bound and sealed with thread so fine it looks like silver spun from size. Historians don't mention this room much, they focus on the grand salons, the frescoed ceilings, the documented grandeur, but fringe lore calls this place il punto di ritorno, the point of return. The space where the palace decides whether you leave changed, or whether you never truly leave at all. Tonight, as you approach the book, the thread loosens, not snapped, just surrendered, and when you lift the cover, the pages inside shimmer with ink that vanishes before your eye can fix it, writing itself only long enough for memory to understand and then letting go. Each page bears a fragment of what you've seen, but not exactly reflections altered slightly. As if memory is more reliable than fact, and in the margins you find phrases like "she sang only when the silence wept," and "the mask was never removed, only believed forgotten." You realize now this isn't a record, it's a mirror made of story, one that remembers you through metaphor, not image, and as you close the book, a single sheet flutters loose, catching no breeze but descending neatly into your hands, and it's blank until your breath hits it. When the faintest outline appears, your own silhouette, blurred at the edges, stitched with threads made of time and curiosity, you tuck it back into the tome, and from behind one column, the distant sound of water laps against stone, familiar now, comforting like a lullaby from a city that doesn't sleep but listens. Fringe thinkers say the palace only allows its story to be finished by those who earn it, and tonight, as the final candles dim and the shadows stretch like closing eyes, you understand what they meant. Not every ghost is a presence, some are moods, and this one, Venice herself, is feeling quietly pleased. You step toward the entrance, where moonlight filters through sea-stained windows, and as you reach the threshold, the lion-headed knocker gleams once, then fades, and the palace sighs, not to let you go, but to thank you for staying long enough to listen. As you stand beneath the atrium's hanging lanterns, which no longer flicker but simply glow with quiet satisfaction, the air feels less like stone and more like a sigh that finally found release. The palace is quieter now, not empty, just complete. You've walked corridors where shadows carried gossip, stepped through rooms that hummed with forgotten lullabies, and heard stories stitched into silk and soot. Every door you passed didn't just open, it remembered you. This wind down isn't about finality. It's the kind of pause that feels earned. You didn't conquer the mystery, you communed with it. Venice, in its winding, whispering form, let you in. Not through maps or guided tours, but through moods, secrets, and reflections that don't show up in photographs. And as you reach the lion-headed door, you understand, the city never needed to haunt you. She only wanted to be understood. You brush your fingers against the knocker one last time, and instead of cold brass, it feels warm, like someone saying goodbye without words. The canal sighs outside. The palace goes still again. But the story? It will wait here. For the next person willing to listen. For someone like you.